In the quiet corners of privilege, not all passengers are treated the same. And on one particular transcontinental flight across the United States, an unexpected confrontation would reveal just how much character truly matters, especially when no cameras are rolling and the stakes are invisible to most. The private terminal buzzed with hushed voices and polished shoes. Mohamed Salah, global football icon and beloved by millions, moved quietly through the space. Dressed modestly in a hoodie and jeans, he didn't demand attention, but he earned it anyway. A few glances followed him, some eyes widened in recognition, but Salah didn't look for acknowledgement. His goal was simple, a peaceful journey in first class, far from the roaring stadiums and flashing bulbs of the outside world. The airline staff, trained to perfection, greeted him with polite professionalism. One woman at the counter smiled warmly. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Salah. Your seat is ready." He gave a gentle nod, replying with a soft word of thanks. But from across the room, another pair of eyes narrowed at the interaction, not with admiration, but with quiet disapproval. Captain William Reynolds, a grizzled veteran pilot in his 60s, stood near the coffee machine sipping black brew with practiced ease. He had flown for decades, survived storms, emergencies, and reroutes. But what seemed to unsettle him on this day was not turbulence in the skies, but the presence of a man he didn't respect simply because of what he represented. To Reynolds, athletes like Salah were overhyped, overpaid, and underwhelming in real contribution. As Salah walked past, the captain muttered under his breath, "Another spoiled millionaire." On board, Salah settled into his seat. He placed a well-worn book on the tray table, along with a pair of noise-cancelling headphones. He exhaled slowly, grateful for a rare moment of solitude. But his calm would not last long. Back in the cockpit, Captain Reynolds began preparing for takeoff. As he ran through standard procedures, he leaned toward a flight attendant passing by and said with a smirk, "These guys think they own the world just because they can kick a ball." The attendant, unsure how to respond, offered an awkward half-smile before hurrying back down the aisle. In the row ahead of Salah sat James Carter, a retired U.S. Marine with a weathered look and sharp instincts. He watched the interaction between the captain and the crew with growing suspicion. Years of service had taught him to pick up on cues, small, subtle acts of disrespect, body language that screamed louder than words. Something wasn't right. The aircraft roared to life and lifted off into the skies. Salah closed his eyes. What he didn't know was that the peace he craved would be tested by the man who held the power of the flight in his hands. Once the plane reached cruising altitude, a hum of comfort returned to the cabin. Passengers relaxed with champagne, opened laptops or flicked through magazines. Salah flipped through his book, the calm helping him unwind. But not far away, Captain Reynolds had one more move to make. He pressed the intercom button, voice smooth and composed. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for choosing our airline. We're committed to offering excellent service to all our passengers, whether they're hard-working professionals or simply lucky enough to have the right connections." The words were subtle, but their weight was unmistakable. A few passengers exchanged glances, some raised eyebrows, others stared blankly, unsure what to make of the tone. Salah heard the announcement and recognized the undercurrent. He had heard these barbs before, resentment masked as professionalism. But instead of reacting, he turned another page in his book. The flight attendants continued their rounds, trays in hand. One of them, a young woman named Emma, approached Salah with a gentle smile. "Would you like something to drink, Mr. Salah?" Her voice was kind, but her eyes betrayed discomfort. "Water is fine," Salah replied, his voice calm. Just a few rows ahead, James Carter took notice again. He didn't like what he was seeing. He had faced enemies overseas, seen good men rise and fall, but this kind of quiet power play, this passive-aggressive hostility, was something that always made his skin crawl. Minutes later, Captain Reynolds stepped out of the cockpit under the pretense of checking on the first-class passengers. He walked past Salah's seat, then paused. "Didn't know football paid this well," he said casually, eyes scanning Salah with the kind of gaze that dared him to respond. Salah looked up, expression even. "It's a sport that brings people together," he said softly. Reynolds gave a dry chuckle. Sure. Some people just get all the luck. Without waiting for a response, he continued down the aisle, smug and satisfied. James Carter clenched his jaw. He'd had enough of men like this. He wasn't going to sit idle forever, and this flight, it was far from over. Tension, though invisible, has a way of infecting a space. In the cabin of first class, it lingered like an unspoken warning. Conversations were quieter, movements more measured, and although no one said anything outright, more and more passengers began to notice the unease shadowing the back of Captain Reynolds's words and actions. Mohammed Salah, ever composed, tried to keep his focus on the book resting on his lap. He'd learned over the years to deal with veiled hostility through silence and restraint, but something about this situation gnawed at him differently. This wasn't just about status or fame, it was about principle. Across the aisle, James Carter watched with growing disgust. The retired Marine had seen men wield power like a weapon before, not with guns, but with attitude, with rules bent for ego, with false decorum masking contempt. And that's exactly what he saw unfolding here, an abuse of authority from a man who happened to control an entire aircraft. A short while later, a flight attendant appeared again, her expression noticeably uncomfortable. She leaned down beside Salah's seat and whispered, "Mr. Salah, I'm so sorry to bother you, but the captain has requested that you switch seats." Salah blinked, calmly setting his book down. "Did he give a reason?" The attendant hesitated, then nodded slightly. "He said it's a security protocol." That caught the attention of Carter, who turned sharply in his seat. "That's nonsense," he muttered, his voice just loud enough to be heard. The attendant looked torn, her fingers fidgeting with the corner of her tray. "I'm just relaying the message," she said softly. Salah took a slow breath. He could have agreed, made it easy. But deep down, he knew this wasn't about security. It wasn't about safety. It was a test, a flex, a move meant to diminish him under the guise of procedure. "I'd like to stay where I am," he said gently. The attendant seemed relieved more than anything. "Of course, sir." She backed away, casting a nervous glance toward the cockpit. James Carter leaned slightly toward Salah. "You handled that well," he said. Salah gave a small nod. "I try not to make things worse." Carter grunted, but said nothing more. He respected the restraint, but he also knew something that Salah was too humble to admit. Bullies don't stop unless someone makes them. Moments later, the intercom crackled again. Captain Reynolds's voice returned, seemingly routine, until it wasn't. "Folks, we hope you're enjoying the flight. We do our best to ensure every passenger has a safe and comfortable experience, even those who think money can buy them special treatment." This time, the message wasn't subtle. Heads turned. Passengers glanced around, eyes settling inevitably on Salah. The implication was clear, and it was cruel. Salah set his book aside. He didn't look angry. His face remained a mask of composure, but his fingers lightly tapped the armrest. A quiet rhythm of discomfort. James Carter had enough. He stood. The motion drew attention immediately. Passengers looked up. Flight attendants froze. At the front, Captain Reynolds, who had stepped out again, turned toward the disturbance. "Something wrong, sir?" Reynolds asked, voice tight behind a thin smile. Carter didn't hesitate. "Yeah, there is." Reynolds tried to keep his composure. "I'm just making sure everyone gets the same treatment." "You're not," Carter said flatly. "You're targeting one man and we all see it." There were nods now, confirmation. The tide was shifting. Reynolds stiffened, his face losing some of its smugness. "You're making quite an assumption." "No," Carter replied. "I'm making an observation." A woman in the front row added, "He's right. You've been acting strange since takeoff." The captain's smile vanished. "I suggest you all relax and enjoy the flight." Carter sat down again, but his point had been made. The once silent cabin had now spoken, and Reynolds, whether he liked it or not, had been put on notice. Salah leaned slightly toward Carter. "Thank you," he said. Carter shrugged. "I don't like seeing good people get pushed around." "Neither do I," Salah said quietly. "But sometimes patience is the best answer." Carter exhaled. "We'll see about that." The aircraft moved steadily through the skies, but the atmosphere inside had shifted. Passengers no longer kept their eyes to themselves. Now they watched, quietly, carefully, waiting to see what would happen next. For Salah, the storm wasn't over. It was merely circling. The cabin had fallen into a strained silence. Conversations were sparse, glances discreet, but the underlying current of discomfort was unmistakable. It wasn't just about a pilot and a passenger anymore. It was about principle. It was about who got to hold power in spaces where fairness should be standard. Mohammed Salah sat quietly, fingers resting against the armrest. He didn't look troubled, but inside, he was fully aware of the reality unfolding around him. He had endured microaggressions before. He had handled fame, envy, and the silent judgment of people who saw only his name and not the person behind it. But rarely had it come from someone with such direct control over his surroundings. James Carter watched the cockpit door like a hawk. His military training had taught him to anticipate escalation, and everything about Captain Reynolds' behavior screamed one thing. This man would not back down until he felt he'd won. Sure enough, a few minutes later, the pilot made his next move. The intercom came to life again, and Reynolds' voice filled the cabin with manufactured calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're encountering some turbulence. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts. We'll do our best to keep the ride smooth, but sometimes, no matter how much money you have, you can't control everything." This wasn't a weather report. It was a provocation delivered like a punch with a velvet glove. Passengers shook their heads. Some muttered under their breath. The message was as transparent as it was inappropriate. "What is his problem?" One man whispered to his seatmate. Carter's fists clenched in his lap. It took everything in him not to stand again. Then Emma, the kind flight attendant, approached him. Her hands were shaking slightly as she leaned in. "Sir," she whispered, "I just want you to know, not all of us agree with him." Carter looked up at her, hard eyes softening for a moment. "Then why aren't you stopping him?" She hesitated. "He's the captain. We don't have much power over him." Carter sighed deeply. He knew the hierarchy of the skies. The pilot had ultimate control mid-air. That made this even more dangerous. Just then another voice entered the fray. A man from the row behind Salah leaned forward, his voice directed toward the front of the cabin. "Excuse me, sir," he called. "Are these announcements really necessary?" Captain Reynolds turned from the front, his face tight. "Excuse me." The man didn't back down. "It just seems like you're using the intercom for something other than flight updates." "Across the aisle," a woman chimed in. "I've flown first class for years. I've never seen a pilot behave like this." The murmurs multiplied, heads turned, and just like that, the weight of collective disapproval began to press down. Reynolds's face twitched with restrained fury. His grip on the narrative, the control he had silently enjoyed, was slipping. He cleared his throat. "If anyone has concerns, you're welcome to file a complaint with the airline after we land." Carter scoffed loud enough for others to hear. "Convenient. By then you'll be long gone." Finally, Salah broke his silence. His voice was calm, deliberate. "There's no need for conflict," he said, turning slightly toward Reynolds. "I just came here to travel like everyone else." Reynolds chuckled, but the sound was sharp and bitter. "That's funny, because I don't see everyone else getting special treatment everywhere they go." Silence settled again. Salah stared at him, face unshaken. "I don't ask for special treatment," he replied. Reynolds folded his arms. "Maybe not, but you sure enjoy it." It was ugly, unprofessional, and most importantly, it was witnessed. From the back of the cabin, a deep, quiet voice broke through the fog. "That's enough." Every head turned. A man in his 50s, dressed in casual travel attire, stood up. His presence commanded attention, not because of volume, but because of authority. Captain Reynolds frowned. "Who are you?" The man reached into his jacket, pulled out a small ID badge, and flashed it briefly before tucking it away. The airline's logo gleamed for a second. "I'm James Thornton," he said, "Regional Director of Flight Operations." A heavy silence dropped like a curtain. Reynolds' face turned pale. "Sir, Thornton raised a hand. "We'll discuss this after we land." The pilot froze. There was nothing else to say, and then, slowly, organically, the cabin responded. Passengers clapped. It wasn't loud, it wasn't for show. It was a quiet act of solidarity, a message that someone had finally drawn the line. Reynolds turned without another word and returned to the cockpit. Carter let out a breath. That shut him up. Salah gave a soft nod, eyes locking briefly with Thornton's. A subtle exchange passed between them. Respect, relief. Salah picked up his book again. He hadn't asked for confrontation. He didn't need to prove himself. But when pushed to the edge of dignity, he held firm. And now, with the truth exposed, he hoped that would be enough. For a while, peace returned to the cabin, at least on the surface. Captain Reynolds had been publicly checked by someone with higher authority, and passengers took a collective breath, settling back into their routines. But peace built on embarrassment is fragile, and behind the sealed cockpit door something still simmered. Mohammed Salah sat quietly, the edges of his book untouched now. His posture relaxed, but his mind remained alert. He could feel the eyes on him. Not judgmental this time, but empathetic, respectful. He wasn't angry. He had long trained himself not to be. But there was something exhausting about always having to navigate suspicion, prejudice, and misplaced hostility, especially when he asked for none of it. James Carter remained in his seat, arms crossed, gaze locked on the cockpit. His gut told him it wasn't over. People like Reynolds didn't accept humiliation. They stewed in it, plotted over it, found new ways to reassert themselves. And Carter was right. The cockpit door eventually opened again. Captain Reynolds stepped out, composed in appearance, but there was a stiffness to his walk, a steeliness to his expression that hadn't been there before. He moved down the aisle with purpose and stopped directly beside Salah's seat. The cabin hushed. "Mr. Salah," Reynolds said, voice steady, "I need to have a word with you." Salah looked up. "Is there a problem?" The captain folded his arms. "A passenger reported that you were making others uncomfortable." The words dropped like a stone into water. The ripples reached every row in first class. Eyes widened, breaths held. Even the flight attendants paused mid-service. Carter scoffed. "Oh, that's rich." Salah's expression didn't change. "Uncomfortable how?" Reynolds offered a casual shrug. "Sometimes a man of your stature draws attention. People feel intimidated." Salah gave a small, knowing smile. "I see." Reynolds tilted his head. "Do you?" "I see exactly what you're doing." The pilot's jaw clenched. "Sir, I'm simply following protocol." James Carter stood again. "That's funny because I don't recall harass the passengers you don't like being part of airline protocol." Reynolds turned sharply. "Sir, I suggest you sit down." "Or what?" Carter stepped closer, the tension crackling like static. But before the confrontation could escalate any further, the same calm, authoritative voice cut through the air. "Captain?" "Reynolds," said James Thornton, rising from his seat. "Step aside." The captain froze. His eyes flicked between Carter, Salah, and Thornton. A long pause followed. Then, stiffly, Reynolds turned and walked back toward the cockpit without another word. Carter sat back down, shaking his head. "That guy's got a real problem," Salah let out a quiet breath, a flicker of amusement crossing his face. "People always reveal who they are eventually." "And I've got a feeling," Carter muttered, "his time is running out." The cabin remained still for several minutes. Flight attendants resumed their tasks with a renewed ease. The atmosphere, while still tense, had shifted. There was no longer passive confusion, there was collective awareness. Passengers had taken a side, and that side wasn't the pilot's. Emma, the young flight attendant, stopped by Salah's seat once more. She looked nervous, speaking in a low voice. "I just thought you should know the captain isn't happy." Salah gave her a faint smile. "I figured as much." She hesitated, glancing toward the cockpit. "He's been talking to someone on the radio. I couldn't hear much, but it sounded like he's trying to file a complaint against you." Salah's smile didn't fade, but a muscle in his jaw tightened. "A complaint?" Emma nodded. "He's saying you're disrupting the flight." Carter let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "You've got to be kidding me." Salah thanked Emma for telling him. She walked away, clearly anxious, and he sat, back in his seat, considering the situation. He could push back, he could raise his voice, demand answers, force the issue. But that would be exactly what Reynolds wanted, a reaction. Carter leaned toward him. "You need to do something about this." "If I react, I give him what he wants," Salah replied. "And if you don't?" Salah didn't answer. His silence was its own decision. Then came the next twist. The intercom crackled. Captain Reynolds' voice returned, as calm and official as ever. "This is your captain speaking. Due to an unexpected issue, we will be making an unscheduled landing at an alternate airport. We apologize for any inconvenience." The cabin buzzed immediately. Confused murmurs, exchanged looks, questions from every direction. Carter sat up, straight. "Oh, I do not like the sound of that." Salah remained still, but inside he knew. His instincts whispered the truth. This detour was about him. Flight attendants scrambled to reassure passengers, repeating vague lines about logistics and weather, but it wasn't convincing. James Thornton stood from his seat and made his way to the front. He knocked firmly on the cockpit door. "Captain Reynolds," he called, "a word." After a long pause, the door cracked open. "I'm in the middle of a flight adjustment," Reynolds said curtly. "We need to talk now," Thornton replied. The door opened fully and the two men disappeared inside. Carter leaned toward Salah. "What's your guess?" "He's trying to get rid of me." Carter's expression darkened. "Well, that's not happening." But Salah knew one thing: Reynolds still had power. In the air, the pilot's word carried weight, and until the plane touched ground, that fact could not be ignored. 10 minutes passed, then 15. The cockpit door remained closed, the plane cruising steadily above the clouds, while inside, tension hovered like a thunderstorm ready to break. Passengers, though still seated, had shed their indifference. Conversations were now whispers of speculation. Something serious was happening, and they knew it centered on one man, Mohammed Salah. Finally, the cockpit door opened. James Thornton emerged first, his expression unreadable. Behind him, Captain Reynolds followed, his jaw tight, eyes heavy, with barely concealed frustration. Thornton didn't return to his seat. Instead, he stepped up to the intercom and took a breath before speaking. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the confusion. We will be proceeding to our original destination. As planned." The message spread through the cabin like a silent wave. Passengers exchanged glances, some relieved, others bewildered, but nearly all aware now that whatever had threatened to derail this flight had just been neutralized. Carter smirked. "Looks like someone got overruled." Reynolds didn't say a word. He turned and disappeared back into the cockpit, the door closing behind him with finality. Salah, still in his seat, looked toward Thornton. "What did you say to him?" he asked calmly. Thornton gave a slight smile. "Let's just say he's no longer in charge of this flight." The words hung with weight. They were more than procedural, they were symbolic. For the first time during the journey, someone had stripped Reynolds of the one thing he clung to most: control. The aircraft continued in silence, not tense but reflective. People weren't just thinking about the disruption, they were thinking about what it revealed. That prejudice could still exist at the highest altitudes. That someone as composed and respected as Mohammed Salah could still be treated like a threat simply for being who he was. And that character is not proven when things are easy, but when dignity is tested. As the plane began its descent, the usual anticipation of landing mixed with something deeper. The quiet realization that this flight had exposed more than just a bad apple. It had pulled back the curtain on power, pride, and the quiet strength of restraint. The plane touched down smoothly on the runway of its original destination. As the wheels kissed the tarmac, a shared sense of relief swept through the cabin. No cheers, no applause. Just that collective exhale, the kind people let out when justice, though delayed, finally arrives. Salah remained seated, waiting his turn. He could feel the stares again, but not the kind he dreaded, not the kind that judged. These were eyes of respect, of recognition, not just for his fame, but for the way he had handled himself through it all. Carter stood, stretching his legs. He looked down at Salah and shook his head. Never thought I'd see a pilot try that hard to ruin someone's flight. Salah gave a small, tired smile. Some people fight battles no one else can see. Carter nodded. Yeah, well, some people deserve to lose. The seatbelt signs went off. Passengers gathered their belongings. But instead of rushing for the exit, a few stopped by Salah's seat. You handled that with class, man, one said. Another paused briefly. We all saw what he was doing. You didn't deserve that. Salah nodded in return, thanking them, quietly. He hadn't done any of it for attention, but the acknowledgment, the support, it mattered. Then James Thornton approached. His voice was low but firm. The airline will be handling Reynolds. He won't be flying again any time soon. Carter grinned. Music to my ears. Thornton turned to Salah. I just want to personally apologize. This should never have happened. Salah stood and shook his hand. I appreciate that. With that he gathered his things and stepped into the aisle. No grand gestures, no victorious speech. Just a man, walking off a plane with his head high, and his integrity intact. As he moved toward the exit, a few passengers clapped softly. It wasn't loud. It wasn't performative. It was real. A quiet tribute to a man who had shown that strength doesn't always shout. Sometimes it simply endures. Outside, the terminal lights bathed the walkway in gold. Salah didn't look back. He didn't need to. Justice had found its way through. Not with fury, but with patience, with dignity, and the calm defiance of a man who knew who he was. Because sometimes the loudest statement is silence.